Hello everyone, welcome to part 3 on our series of behavioral interviews. My name is Kenton Kivestu and I'm the founder of RocketBlocks. In today's video, we're going to talk about how to frame and reframe your stories when responding to behavioral interview questions. In parts 1 and 2, for some context, we talked about how to select the right stories and how to structure those stories so that they really hit with impact when you're sharing them. So if you haven't watched those videos yet, I'd recommend pausing here. Check out those videos first, the links are down below, and then come back and revisit us for framing and reframing, which is what we're going to focus on now. And how we're going to do this is we're going to talk first about the mental model that I want you to think about when you're thinking about reframing stories for behavioral interview questions. And then second, we're going to walk through an example. So let's go ahead and jump in. Okay, so the trap that most candidates fall into when they're preparing for behavioral interviews is that they get into this mode where they're saying, okay, if I get question A, I'm going to answer with this specific story. And if I get question B, which is different, I'm going to answer with this specific story. And if I get question C, then I'll use this specific story. And the problem with that is you're overfitting to find very specific stories for each particular question that might come up. And there's thousands of varieties of different behavioral questions that will come up. So you see how this quickly becomes problematic. Well, what I want you to do is I want you to sort of flip the model completely. And instead of thinking about what's the most specific story I can tell to any particular question that comes up, think instead about what are the 5 best stories I have about my career. And if you're struggling thinking about what that list of 5 stories is, go back and watch part 1 on selecting the right stories to tell. We talk all about how to do that. But once you've got your 5 stories, the mental model I want you to have is think about, no matter which question comes up, how can I reframe one of these great stories to answer that question directly? Because that way I can answer that question directly as well as sharing one of my career highlights and the best value that I can bring to the table. Now, the trick that you need to be careful about here is you don't want to end up sounding like a politician, right? Everyone knows that politicians have their talking points, and no matter what question gets asked, they say, oh yeah, that's a great question, and then they immediately jump to their talking points. When I talk about reframing stories, that is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about figuring out a way to configure a particular story so it addresses the question head on, but also highlights the best value props that you have to offer. Think about it sort of this way. Like, imagine being a kid and your parents bring home a brand new Lego set for, a Lego pirate ship. You can take out the instructions and those Lego pieces and you can build that Lego pirate ship. And it looks great. But at the same time, you could take that same Lego set and some mix of those pieces that were offered and reconfigure them and potentially build like a Lego pirate fort. So same Lego set, but 2 totally different outcomes. And that's how I want you to think about your career stories. You have these great set of stories that we work to select in part 1 again. And then you want to think about how can I frame or slightly tweak this story to make it answer this direct question that came up. And so what we're going to do in the next part of this video is we're going to look at an example of doing this and how you would reframe one particular story depending on the question that comes up. Okay, so let's look at this through an example. Let's consider 2 different behavioral interview questions. The first is, tell me about a time you disagreed with a colleague and how did you resolve it? And the second question is, tell me about a time you led a team to an important milestone. And what I want to do is we're first going to look at a single story example and look at the building blocks in that story. We're not going to go into detail on each of those building blocks because the point is just to understand what are the different building blocks we have from the story, and then we're going to look at how we could frame and reframe it to be a good answer to question 1 and question 2. So let's go ahead and throw up the building blocks here. I'm going to run through each of them quickly and then let's talk about reframing. Okay, so we've got the building blocks up. The first is the situation. I was at a company that was acquired, and together with the acquiring company, we set up an aggressive integration plan. The first challenge was basically all around the fact that the timelines were really, really tight, and also there was a lot of pressure to do this integration correctly because the products that my team brought to the table were really important to the future of this particular company, which was public, and so there was pressure from Wall Street. The second big challenge was that we were trying to integrate 2 different ad serving systems, and there were some fundamentally different assumptions about how those systems should work to drive performance. And so that needed to be resolved. Then there was a couple of actions that I took. The first was that there was a lot of action where I was working directly with my counterpart on the other team to resolve how we were going to address that different assumption about how performance should be driven in these two particular systems. The second and third actions were all around the road mapping of actually delivering on this integration and merging our product into the existing product, and then the execution of actually delivering that on a week-by-week basis. And then finally, we've got the result, which was that the systems were successfully integrated, the revenue was moved over, and it opened up a bunch of cross-selling opportunities for the business. Okay, so for answering question 1 with these building blocks, how I would do it is I would start with the situation. Then I would immediately jump into challenge number 2, which is focused on the differing assumptions between the two advertising systems and really frame the story around that disagreement between the two teams and the systems themselves. Then moving through the rest of the story, I would focus on action number 1, which is really about all the detail about how I went about resolving that particular disagreement with my colleague, the data that I used, the debates that we had, and the ultimate plan that I proposed that ended up working. And then finally, ending with the result. So if you think about that and look at all the building blocks we had to choose from, there's a lot that actually gets left on the cutting room floor there. We don't really touch that much on challenge number 1 in this telling, and we don't touch really at all probably on action 2 and action 3, because those aren't the most salient details for this story. Some of that might get pulled in, especially maybe on the challenge part. You might pull in a little bit from the tight timelines and things like that, just to indicate the amount of pressure in this scenario. But really, you're taking the story and you're framing it around challenge 2, and then including and highlighting only the actions that are really addressing that particular challenge. So that's a really good example of how this story might address that first question. Now, you can think about this same story and how it would address the second question. In the second question, if you're telling this story, you'd probably start with the situation. You'd probably really lean into challenge number 1, the tight timelines, the pressure from Wall Street, all of those things. And then you may actually skip challenge number 2 and action number 1 entirely and just focus on challenge number 1 and actions number 2 and 3, which are really around running the project correctly, setting up the roadmap, executing against it, and then of course ending with the result. In both cases, you now have a story which perfectly meets the particulars of the question asked of you, but also you're highlighting one of your best career moments, so you know you have a really good story that has a good situation, a good challenge, a really good result that you can share that helps you paint yourself in your best light and share some of your career highlights, but also directly answers the particular question that the interviewer asked of you. Okay, so that's a wrap on our behavioral interview series. But one last thing I'll share with you is that as you're going through this process and you're preparing and you're thinking about selecting those stories, figuring out how to really structure them so that they hit with impact, and then reframing and framing those same stories so you can leverage your best career highlights to share in your interviews, know that this stuff all gets better with practice. The more you do it, the easier it gets. You find sort of little tweaks and improvements you can make that really make a big difference in making sure you really land those stories and tell them in such a way that really conveys the impact that you could truly have. We have a new module on RocketBlocks that helps you prepare for behavioral interviews and practice going through these motions of selecting the right stories and structuring those stories to a whole host of behavioral interview questions. So I'd really encourage you to check it out. Thanks again for watching, and if you haven't subscribed yet already, please do so below. There is a big red button. We've got a ton of great content coming out on a weekly basis. Thanks again, and have a great day.